In 1942, when President Getúlio Vargas announced that Brazil would send troops to fight in Europe, skeptics across Brazil responded with a saying, "É mais fácil uma cobra fumar do que o Brasil entrar na guerra." It's easier for a snake to smoke than for Brazil to go to war. The phrase captured everything doubters believed. Brazil was unprepared, untrained, too far away, too tropical, too inexperienced to matter in a modern industrial war between global powers. A snake smoking was ridiculous. Brazil fighting in Europe was equally ridiculous. On July 1, 1944, the first contingent of approximately 5,800 Brazilian soldiers boarded transport ships in Rio de Janeiro bound for Italy. They wore patches on their uniforms showing a coiled snake with a lit pipe in its mouth. Above the image, printed in bold letters, "A Cobra vai fumar." The snake will smoke. The symbol was deliberate mockery. The skeptics had said it was impossible. The soldiers would prove them wrong. By May 2, 1945, when German forces in Italy surrendered, those Brazilian soldiers, the Força Expedicionária Brasileira, the FEB, the Smoking Snakes, had captured 2,573 Axis prisoners, including 2 generals and approximately 900 officers. They'd inflicted an estimated 20,000 to 30,000 casualties on German forces. They'd liberated Italian towns and villages. They'd fought in some of the most brutal mountain warfare of the European theater, and they'd made the snake smoke. Can a country written off as irrelevant prove skeptics wrong through combat? Can a symbol born from mockery become a badge of honor? Please like this video to see how the smoking snakes did it. Subscribe for more FEB stories, and let's go back to 1942, when Brazil's entry into World War II seemed impossible. Brazil in 1942 was officially neutral in World War II, despite being increasingly aligned with the Allies. President Getúlio Vargas, who'd ruled Brazil since 1930, first as provisional president after a coup, then as constitutional president from 1934, then as dictator from 1937 onward under the authoritarian Estado Novo regime, was playing both sides. He negotiated with the United States for economic and military aid. He also negotiated with Germany for similar benefits. Vargas was a pragmatist. He'd support whoever offered Brazil the best deal. Throughout 1940 and 1941, that appeared to be Germany. Nazi Germany was winning. The United States hadn't entered the war. Backing the winning side made sense. Then 2 things changed Brazil's calculation. First, in December 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, and Germany declared war on the United States. The United States was now fully committed to the war, and American industrial power made Allied victory probable rather than speculative. Second, German U-boats began sinking Brazilian merchant ships in 1942. The sinkings weren't accidents. They were deliberate attacks on neutral Brazilian shipping carrying supplies to Allied nations. Between February and August 1942, German submarine U-507 sank 6 Brazilian merchant vessels: Baipendi, Araraquara, Anibal Benevolo, Itagiba, Arará, and Jacira. Approximately 600 Brazilian civilians, merchant sailors, passengers, died. Brazilian public opinion, which had been divided or apathetic about the war, turned furiously anti-Axis. Protests erupted in Rio de Janeiro, São Paulo, and other cities. Mobs attacked German and Italian businesses. The pressure on Vargas to declare war became overwhelming. On August 22, 1942, Brazil declared war on Germany and Italy. This declaration was symbolic initially. Brazil had no military force capable of deploying to Europe in 1942. The Brazilian army in 1942 consisted of approximately 90,000 men equipped with obsolete weapons, minimal training, and no combat experience. The last time Brazilian forces had fought a major engagement was the Constitutionalist Revolution of 1932, a 3-month civil war between São Paulo state and the federal government. Brazilian officers had no experience with modern combined arms warfare, no experience coordinating with air support, no experience with armored operations. Creating a force that could fight in Europe would require years of preparation, American training, American equipment, and American logistical support. This is why skeptics said, "É mais fácil uma cobra fumar." It's easier for a snake to smoke. Not because Brazilians lacked courage, because Brazil lacked the industrial capacity, the training infrastructure, the institutional experience to field a modern military force in Europe. The United States had those capabilities and was struggling to deploy millions of men overseas. How could Brazil, with a fraction of America's resources, accomplish something similar? The snake smoking seemed more plausible, but Vargas was committed. In August 1943, after intense negotiations with the United States, Brazil and America signed agreements establishing the Força Expedicionária Brasileira, the Brazilian Expeditionary Force, abbreviated FEB. The force would be trained, equipped, and supplied by the United States. Brazilian soldiers would be integrated into U.S. Fifth Army operations in Italy. The goal was to send approximately 25,000 men, enough for one full division, to demonstrate Brazilian commitment without overwhelming American logistical capacity. Training began in early 1944 at bases in Rio de Janeiro state. American advisors taught Brazilian officers and NCOs U.S. Army tactics, procedures, and equipment operation. Brazilian recruits, most from poor families, most with minimal education, most who'd never traveled beyond their home states, learned to be soldiers. The first contingent departed Brazil on July 1, 1944. By this point, someone, accounts vary on who, though credit is often given to Sargento Ewaldo Meyer, had designed the FEB's symbol, a coiled snake with a lit pipe in its mouth, smoke rising from the pipe bowl. The image was printed on shoulder patches, painted on vehicles, stamped on stationery. It was everywhere. When questioned about it, soldiers explained, "The skeptics said a snake smoking was more likely than Brazil going to war. We're here. The snake is smoking." The symbol transformed mockery into identity. What had been an insult became a rallying cry. The phrase had multiple interpretations. In Portuguese, a Cobra vai fumar could mean the snake will smoke, but it also carried connotations of violence. Things will get serious. All hell will break loose. The soldiers embraced both meanings. Yes, they were making the impossible possible. And yes, when they arrived in Italy, things would get serious for German defenders. The FEB even published a newspaper titled, "E a Cobra fumou," and the snake smoked. The publication covered unit activities, printed letters from home, provided news from other fronts. It reinforced unit identity and reminded everyone why they were there. The symbol gained international recognition in early 1945 when Walt Disney himself created a version of the smoking snake for the Brazilian troops. At the request of the Brazilian newspaper O Globo, Disney Studios drew a cartoon version of the FEB's mascot, a fierce-looking cobra wearing a military helmet, smoking a pipe, with an aggressive expression. The Disney version was published on February 22, 1945 in O Globo and became wildly popular in Brazil. It represented American recognition of Brazilian contributions. Disney, whose studio had created propaganda and morale-boosting material for Allied forces throughout the war, had chosen to honor the smoking snakes. The cartoon was reproduced on posters, in newspapers, and eventually found its way to Italy, where FEB soldiers saw it and appreciated the validation from America's most famous animator. The symbol's power extended beyond morale. It became psychological warfare against Axis forces. German and Italian soldiers encountering Brazilian units for the first time didn't know what to expect. The snake symbol was alien to European military iconography. It was exotic, tropical, strange. German intelligence reports from Italy in late 1944 noted with some confusion that American-equipped troops bearing snake insignia were operating in the Apennines. Were these Americans with unusual patches? Were they a specialized unit? Information about the FEB's identity spread slowly through German defensive positions. When German prisoners were processed and realized they'd been defeated by Brazilians, troops from a country they knew almost nothing about, the psychological impact was significant. They'd been beaten by an unknown quantity. That uncertainty eroded confidence. The Axis attempted counter-propaganda. German aircraft dropped leaflets over FEB positions, showing images of destroyed Brazilian units, wounded soldiers, devastation. The leaflets asked, "Why are you dying for someone else's war? Why are you here? Your families need you in Brazil. Desert now and save your life." The messages attempted to exploit the distance between Brazil and Italy. Thousands of kilometers, completely different climate, different language, different culture. Why were Brazilians dying in Italian mountains? The propaganda assumed Brazilian soldiers hadn't thought deeply about this question. The propaganda was wrong. FEB soldiers knew exactly why they were there. 600 Brazilian civilians had died on ships sunk by German submarines. Brazilian sovereignty had been violated when U-boats attacked neutral Brazilian vessels in Brazilian waters. The war was personal. Additionally, many FEB soldiers were from communities with German or Italian immigrant populations. They'd heard pro-Axis sentiment from some immigrants. They'd seen Brazilian fascist movements, the integralists, advocate for alignment with Germany. Fighting in Italy wasn't abstract foreign policy. It was defending Brazil's democratic independence against totalitarian aggression. The German propaganda leaflets were collected, laughed at, and occasionally used as toilet paper. The psychological operations failed completely. Between July 1944 and February 1945, approximately 25,234 Brazilian soldiers arrived in Italy in 5 contingents. They were organized as the 1st Expeditionary Infantry Division under General João Batista Mascarenhas de Moraes and attached to the U.S. 5th Army's Arfour Corps. Their assigned sector was the Northern Apennines, the mountainous spine of Italy where Allied forces were attempting to break through German defensive lines toward the Po Valley and ultimately Bologna. The strategic situation in Italy by mid-1944 was a grinding positional war. German forces held prepared defensive positions in mountains. Allied forces attacked those positions repeatedly with massive material superiority, but limited success. Casualties on both sides were enormous. Progress was measured in meters. The FEB's first combat action occurred on September 16, 1944, when Brazilian patrols engaged German positions near Massa Rosa. This was a reconnaissance in force, limited attacks designed to probe German defenses and gain experience. The attack succeeded. Brazilian troops took Massa Rosa, then Camaiore, then Monte Prano in the following weeks. These were small victories against limited opposition, but they demonstrated that Brazilian troops could execute basic combat operations. More importantly, they gave the FEB combat experience. Units learned how to coordinate artillery support, how to maneuver under fire, how to consolidate positions after taking them. The learning curve was steep, but FEB officers and soldiers learned quickly. Then came Monte Castello. Between November 1944 and February 1945, the FEB participated in 6 attacks on Monte Castello, a 977-meter peak controlling Route 64 to Bologna. The first 5 attacks failed with significant casualties. The February 21, 1945 attack succeeded, with Brazilian troops taking the summit in 12 hours of continuous combat after 3 months of Allied failures. Monte Castello became the FEB's defining battle, proof that Brazilian troops could accomplish what others couldn't. But Monte Castello wasn't the end. It was the beginning of the spring offensive that would win the war in Italy. After Monte Castello, the FEB continued offensive operations throughout March and April 1945. They attacked Castelnuovo di Vergato on March 5th. They attacked Torre di Neroni. They attacked Montese on April 14th, one of the bloodiest days for the FEB, but a critical victory that broke German defensive lines. They advanced toward the Po Valley, and on April 29, 1945, near the towns of Fornovo di Taro and Collecchio, the FEB accepted the surrender of 3 German divisions: the entire German 148th Infantry Division, elements of the Italian Monte Rosa Division, and elements of the Italian San Marco Division. The surrender included 14,179 German and Italian soldiers, approximately 4,000 horses, and 2,500 vehicles. One Brazilian division had accepted the surrender of 3 Axis divisions. The ratio alone was remarkable. But the symbolic significance was even greater. The battle for Montisi deserves specific attention because it demonstrated the FEB's evolution from inexperienced force to combat-effective division. Montisi was a fortified town on high ground, controlling approaches to the Po Valley. German defenders had prepared the position for months. They'd registered artillery on every approach. They'd mined the roads. They'd positioned machine guns to create interlocking fields of fire. Taking Montisi required coordination between infantry, artillery, armor, and engineers, the kind of combined arms operation that only experienced units could execute. The attack began on April 14, 1945 at dawn. Brazilian artillery conducted a preparatory bombardment for 2 hours. Then infantry advanced behind the artillery barrage in a technique called rolling barrage. The artillery fire moved forward at a walking pace, and infantry followed immediately behind it, reaching German positions before defenders could recover from the shelling. The tactic worked. By midday, Brazilian troops had entered Montese, but street fighting continued for 3 more days. German defenders fought house to house, room to room. Brazilian infantry cleared buildings methodically using grenades, small arms, and close-quarters combat. By April 17th, Montisi was secure. The victory opened the final approach to Bologna. The conquest of Montise broke 2 German defensive lines simultaneously: the Gothic Line, the main defensive position across northern Italy, and the Genghis Khan Line, a secondary fallback position. Breaking both in one operation was strategically decisive. German forces south of the Po River could no longer maintain a coherent defense. They retreated north, but Allied forces, including the FEB, advanced faster than they could retreat. The encirclement was beginning, the total accounting for the FEB's participation in World War II. 20,573 Axis prisoners captured over the entire campaign. 2 German generals captured: General Otto Freder Pico, commanding LXXV Army Corps, and General Karl Friedrich von Schellwitz. Approximately 900 Axis officers captured, an estimated 20,000 to 30,000 Axis casualties inflicted. All of this accomplished by a force of 25,134 men, meaning the FEB captured nearly as many prisoners as its own total strength. The ratio of prisoners captured to FEB personnel deployed was approximately 1.1.2. For a division-sized force fighting as part of a larger Allied army, this was an extraordinary achievement. But the numbers don't capture the psychological impact. German soldiers defending in Italy in 1945 expected to face Americans, British, Polish forces. They didn't expect Brazilians. When German prisoners were processed and learned they'd been captured by the FEB, many expressed surprise. Brazil? Brazil was in South America. What were they doing in Italy? The presence of Brazilian troops disrupted German assumptions about who they were fighting and why. German propaganda attempted to demoralize the FEB with leaflets dropped from aircraft showing destroyed Brazilian units, messages saying, "Why are you dying for a foreign cause?" The propaganda failed. FEB soldiers understood exactly why they were there. 600 Brazilian civilians had been killed by German submarines. Brazilian sovereignty had been violated. The war was personal. The FEB's service ended on May 2, 1945, when German forces in Italy surrendered. The Brazilian flag flew over conquered territory. The smoking snakes had proven that a snake could indeed smoke. Between May and August 1945, the FEB was repatriated to Brazil in phases. They returned as heroes. Parades welcomed them in Rio de Janeiro, São Paulo, and cities across Brazil. Newspapers celebrated them. Politicians praised them. For a brief period, the FEB represented everything Brazil wanted to believe about itself, that it could compete on the world stage, that it mattered, that its soldiers could fight alongside great powers and distinguish themselves. Then something strange happened. The FEB was quietly dismantled. Veterans were discharged. Officers who'd commanded in combat were assigned to remote garrisons. The institutional experience the FEB had gained, the only Latin American combat experience in the European theater, was deliberately not integrated into the broader Brazilian army. Why? Because the FEB represented a threat to the existing military establishment. The Exército de Caxias, the old Brazilian army that had stayed home, feared competition from combat veterans who could claim superior experience. General Eurico Gaspar Dutra and other senior officers who hadn't gone to Italy worried that FEB veterans would dominate promotions, command positions, and political influence. To prevent this, they marginalized FEB veterans, scattered them across the country, and effectively suppressed their institutional legacy. The political situation complicated this further. The FEB had fought for democracy against fascism, but Brazil in 1945 was still ruled by Vargas's authoritarian Estado Novo regime. Brazilian soldiers returned from fighting dictatorship in Europe to find dictatorship at home. The contradiction was obvious and uncomfortable. In October 1945, Vargas was deposed in a coup. Elections were held, but the FEB veterans who'd fought for democracy found themselves silenced, ignored, or actively suppressed when they tried to discuss their war experiences or advocate for democratic reforms. Employment was difficult. Many FEB veterans had been recruited at ages when they should have been learning trades. They'd spent 1944-1945 fighting in Italy instead of establishing careers. When they returned, former employers were required to rehire them, but often fired them shortly afterward, claiming incompetence or war neuroses. Unemployment among FEB veterans was significantly higher than the general population. Some turned to begging, some became destitute. The men who'd captured 20,573 prisoners were struggling to feed their families. The symbol remained. The snake smoking a pipe stayed in Brazilian culture even as FEB veterans were forgotten. The phrase, "a Cobra vai fumar," entered common usage, meaning things are getting serious or someone's about to act. But the connection to the FEB faded. By the 1960s and 1970s, most Brazilians knew the expression without knowing its origin. The snake had become divorced from the soldiers who'd made it real. The suppression of FEB memory was systematic and deliberate. Military academies stopped teaching FEB tactics. Official histories minimized Brazilian contributions. When the FEB was mentioned, it was often portrayed as a minor participant in a campaign won by American and British forces. Veterans who tried to publish memoirs or give interviews faced resistance. Some were warned explicitly by military authorities that discussing the war in detail was inappropriate. The message was clear. The FEB had served. Brazil was proud. Now move on, and don't make the old army look bad by comparison. This suppression had consequences. An entire generation of Brazilians grew up unaware that their country had fought in World War II. Schools didn't teach it. Textbooks mentioned it briefly or not at all. By the 1980s, FEB veterans were in their 60s and 70s, and their story was being lost. Several veterans began organizing, forming associations, demanding recognition. They pointed out that Brazil was the only Latin American country to send combat troops to Europe. They'd accomplished something unique, and they were being erased. The breakthrough came in the 1990s and 2000s, when Brazilian historians and filmmakers rediscovered the FEB. Academic research documented the campaign in detail. Books were published. Documentaries were produced. The 2014 film Road 47, Estrada 47, dramatized FEB combat experiences for a new generation. The 2017 film The Smoking Snake provided a comprehensive documentary history. Museums opened. The FEB Memorial in Rio de Janeiro, the Brazilian Military History Museum, and exhibitions across Brazil began preserving artifacts, oral histories, and photographs. Recognition came slowly. In the 1980s and 1990s, surviving FEB veterans began organizing, demanding recognition and pensions. Historians began researching the FEB's contributions. In 2000, the Brazilian government established August 25th as Soldiers' Day, commemorating the FEB's first combat in World War II. Monuments were built. Museums opened. The FEB was rediscovered by Brazilians who hadn't known their country had fought in Europe. Today, the snake smoking a pipe is recognized as one of Brazil's most powerful national symbols. It represents determination, defiance, and the capacity to achieve the impossible. It appears on military insignia, in popular culture, in political rhetoric. When Brazilians want to say they'll accomplish something others consider impossible, they invoke the smoking snake. The mockery became the monument. That's the story of the smoking snakes, the Força Expeditionária Brasileira that proved a snake could smoke by capturing 20,573 prisoners, inflicting 20,000, 30,000 casualties, and fighting through the Italian mountains in winter. That's the story of 25,134 men who turned an insult into an identity and made the impossible routine. If this story reminds you that mockery can become motivation, that symbols matter, and that dismissed countries can surprise the world, hit that like button. Subscribe for more FEB stories. The Smoking Snakes have more to tell. Turn on notifications. Comment where you're watching from and whether you'd heard of the FEB before. We read everyone. Thank you for watching. We'll see you in the next one.